All right, welcome to 22-2, where we're going to talk about and introduce the immune system. So first, let's go ahead and identify what immunity means. So immunity means that essentially you have resistance, where resistance is the ability of the body to maintain its immunity. And immunity, in this sense, is being able to defend yourself against some sort of pathogen or some sort of bacteria, for the purposes of this chapter anyway. And we have two different types of immunity: innate, which can also be called nonspecific, and adaptive, which can also be called specific. Innate is a nice term. Adaptive is a nice term. I think it describes what both of the systems do. But I think sometimes it's a little bit easier to first start by learning this as nonspecific versus specific. But if one pair makes a little bit more sense than the other pair for you, awesome, stick with it while you're studying it. Just be familiar with all four terms when it comes time to test day. So innate, or the nonspecific immunity, is an example would be like physical barriers that everyone has. It's a universal trait. It's a universal type of immune defense that we have as humans. So you can go from human to human within that same species, and everyone's going to have this type of defense mechanism. Another example are like phagocytes, like natural killer cells, which we had mentioned in the previous video, are non-specific type of cells that are able to detect non-self cells and are able to flag them and destroy them accordingly. And then we have the adaptive or the specific immune system, which basically contains T and B cells. And T and B cells need to learn how to become T and B cells, so they have to adapt not only to become that cell A, but B, they also have to adapt to whatever the pathogen or bacteria is that they see at the time. So B cells tend to learn things and then act accordingly. T cells can help B cells learn things, but T cells can also act on their own as well. And so we'll talk about this as we go through this chapter. We also need to remind ourselves about lymphocytes in both the, lymphocytes, which we learned from the blood chapter. Lymphocytes are also known as white blood cells. They're floating around in the in the formed elements of blood. And just like the red blood cells, they also originate from the red bone marrow. So that's what this image is showing you, is that whenever they need to be made, they go to the red bone marrow, and the red bone marrow says, okay, I'm going to take this hematopoietic stem cell and turn it into the correct precursor stem cell, like a lymphatic stem cell, or lymphoid stem cell, excuse me. And then that lymphoid stem cell might turn into a, let's zoom in on this picture, might turn into a not yet mature but about to become mature T cell. Or maybe it might do the same thing but for a B cell. Or maybe it'll go and become a natural killer cell and just provide regular surveillance for the rest of the body. In the lifespan, only about 80% of any of the cells will survive a total of 4 years. There are only some cells that will live longer than that, and for certain there's many other cells that will live a lot less than 4 years. Some will last as long as 20 years. And like I said, they all start production in the red bone marrow. Something to get into before we really dive into this topic is kind of like how to outline what's going on in this chapter. So I'm going to do that here on the right. So we already talked about what the relevant parts are for the immune system, but now let's kind of talk about why we care about the immune system. Right, so the first part of the immune system, right, is like, okay, well, what do we do whenever we come across a pathogen that is not good for us, right? There's this idea that we have the cells, I'll put those in the quotes, I guess, versus the non-self cells, right? So this is like, I have my own lung, and I have my own skin, and I have my own hair, right? And somehow my body is able to detect that someone else's lung or someone else's hair or someone else's nail cell is different than my cell. And we need to have a mechanism. That was my cat. We need to have a mechanism for our cells to be able to defend ourselves against non-like cells. So all our immune system is concerned with is to learn what is us and what is what is us, and therefore what is not us must be destroyed, essentially, which sounds kind of terrible, but really it's ones and zeros, like a computer, right? We're able to identify when we see a cell that's ourself, and we're therefore able to identify cells that are not ourselves, because anything that doesn't look like ourself must be a threat, and we got to get rid of it for whatever reason. If this doesn't make sense to you, think about like a organ transplant, right? Like if you receive a portion of a liver from someone else, now you have a portion of your liver sitting up right next to someone else's liver, and it's going to take your body some time to adjust to understand that that new liver is now yourself. It's not foreign, and we shouldn't attack it because we need that new liver. And in fact, in order to even do those kinds of transplants, you have to suppress the immune system so that it doesn't reject those other tissues. And that's what we mean by rejection, is getting rid of the non-self cells. Okay, so that's number one. That's probably self-explanatory, but I gotta mention it. And number two is that what happens whenever we actually find this pathogen, right? What do we do when we find the pathogen and destroy it? So, so what happens when well, first of all, what happens when we find the pathogen? Right? And when I say pathogen, I guess I should be explicit on this. Whenever I say pathogen, this could be a virus, it could be a bacteria, but essentially whenever I say pathogen, I want you to think antigen, because it's really the protein components of this pathogen that get recognized by the cells. So we're thinking really, really small things. So what happens when we find the pathogen? How do we know that it's a pathogen? How do we interact with a pathogen to figure out that it's a pathogen? What do we do to it if we figure out it's a pathogen? Right, so that's the next step. What do we do when we find out it's foreign? Foreign. Yeah, that looks right. What do we do when we find out it's foreign? Do we attack it right away? Do we swallow it whole and digest its bits? Do we do that and then explode into pus? Do we look at it from a distance and then like go and talk to the other cells and gossip and say like, oh, we see that so-and-so is over there and we don't like so-and-so, right? Like what do we do when we ever find out it's a foreign pathogen? And then finally, how do we actually handle the pathogen? So how do we get rid of the pathogen? Right, so how do we destroy it? Okay, and then what happens the next time? Right, so sure, you get rid of the pathogen. Okay, cool, great. But the immune system isn't stupid, and it's very efficient, and it wants to be prepared for the next go-around. So if the same pathogen comes back into the body wants to have a better, faster mechanism of getting rid of it the second time. And we need to understand the differences between what happens the first time it sees that pathogen and what happens the second time it sees the same pathogen. Okay? So those are some of the questions that I think will help us kind of organize our thought process as we go through this. Essentially, what we'll talk about first is how do we universally get rid of pathogens between any human. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how one human can more specifically target a pathogen. And then we'll talk about how after we target that pathogen, how do we use antibodies to actually get rid of that pathogen. And we'll also talk about what happens if that pathogen comes around a second time. See you in the next one.